Today we're going to look at the first stage of a classical argument, which is the introduction. Introductions to a classical argument are often close-ups. Maybe it's something really specific. Sometimes it's so specific that your reader won't know exactly what your paper's about immediately. That's okay. It's like the start of a good movie. Sometimes they often start with close-ups too. Part of catching your reader's interest is arousing her curiosity or her feelings. Introductions often appeal to pathos. If you're arguing, for instance, that America should rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, perhaps you'd start with some specific effect of global warming, such as the plight of the polar bear. Introductions, therefore, often appeal to pathos. They often have a narrative element. There can be a narrative element to introductions even when they are introductions to argument research papers. And introductions are often topical. That means they have to do with something current that we're aware of, perhaps from the news. Look at an introduction I wrote for a research paper arguing for school uniforms. When I first came to high school, now that's pretty topical because my audience happens to be ninth graders that I'm making this argument to, my fellow ninth graders. I admired everyone in the uniform. So there's a pathos appeal right there, pride, right? The cheerleaders, the band, the football team, they all had uniforms. When we had our first pep rally, it seemed that everyone who participated had on a uniform. I didn't have one on though. So already there's a dramatic effect, right? We've got a little bit of a narrative going on here. The lonely freshman. I was sitting with the rest of the freshmen in the stands. As I was cupping my hands over my ears and stomping on the bleachers, it occurred to me, what if everyone in school had on a uniform? And you can use questions, hypotheticals in your intros. They work very well. Now that last sentence comes pretty close to not working, but somehow it works. But usually you don't want to tell your audience yet what you want them to do or think. Why? You might ask, why not? Tell them. Why put it off? It's because it's more effective this way. You give up your opportunity for an effective intro and background if you simply jump right in, as you usually do with a 5-paragraph essay, and tell them what to think. My son seemed to understand this at the age of 6. He held up 2 screwdrivers and asked me, if you were going to give me one of your screwdrivers, would you give me the big one or the small one? Warren, I responded, I'm not going to give you any of my screwdrivers. I know, he responded. You may use my screwdrivers, but they remain mine. I know, but if you were going to give me one, I think I know which one you would give me. Okay, so let's take a look at this so far. He's basically given me an introduction. I wanted to jump right to the proposition. I wanted to get right to what I thought his point was and dispense with the introduction of the background. But he insisted on the introduction here, which was to puzzle me about, which one would I give him if I acted out this hypothetical that he posed in his introduction. One other thing about a good introduction, sometimes they include hypotheticals. Let's go to the background. Yeah, okay, which one, Warren? The small one, he says and grins. Well, a week later, it was his screwdriver. Now, it was an implicit background, admittedly. He didn't have to say, he just used 3 words. The whole background came up, like I'm the daddy and I'm the big guy and he's the little guy and he's following after me and he wants to be just like me. So if I have a screwdriver, then he wants a screwdriver. I mean, it really just touched my heart. What can I say? But all that background came about because the introduction that he had led up to it. So he would have given up all of that if he just came up and said, hey, Dad, can I have this screwdriver? I mean, I would have just said no, and it would have been the end of it. But he decided not to go the route of the 5-paragraph essay. He used classical argument, being a well-trained rhetorician at the age of 6. Let's look at the introduction of one of my research papers, this paper called Freedom and Civic Life. This is an argument research paper written on April 18th of 2020. I begin, the morning we're writing this, the front page of my hometown paper, the Virginia Peninsula's Daily Press, features this banner headline, "Calls to reopen state get louder." 6 months ago, such a headline would have been unimaginable. In what sense, we might have wondered then, would Virginia be closed? But since then, disaster in the form of the coronavirus struck, prompting Virginia's Governor Ralph Northam, like almost all of the other United States' governors, to issue orders closing most businesses and confining most residents largely to their homes. Now, my paper is not exactly on the coronavirus. It's not even on disasters in general, but I use them to argue later that we need a local civic life again to survive as a democracy. So I really haven't yet raised my issue yet here, and it's fine to keep things relatively mysterious in certain ways. I'll get to it later in my intro, hint at it a bit more. But right now, I am zooming in here in the first line. I'm using a narrative element here. What will the governors do? I go on. After almost universal compliance with such orders, driven largely by experts warning that such measures are necessary to keep health care facilities from being overwhelmed, many residents now want the orders abrogated for entire industries, or at least modified to better account for a variety of local differences. So it's topical. It's in the news at that point. Your introduction doesn't have to have all these things going on in it, but it's nice to have a lot of things to choose from. It also gets quite specific. It talks about the Virginia legislature, Republican leaders in there, a particular newspaper. There's lots of specifics that make it more interesting, and that's part of what a close-up is all about, right? Getting really specific. I won't go through all of the intro in this video. You can read it yourself. It's attached to this assignment. Now I'll read just the end here. Should localities instead have inherent powers? The questions are good. You can have questions in your intro. They can be good. But don't make them too argumentative or too simple. Don't just ask the question that you intend to answer just because you want, you can't think of anything better to do. Instead, make it well placed. Lead up to it in some way that makes it an interesting question and not an obvious one. I go on. If localities had inherent powers, would people even want to take responsibility for their localities? So hypotheticals can be good. The hypothetical is based on the supposition that localities had inherent powers. So I'm supposing that, which makes the question a hypothetical question. Thank you for watching this video on how to write an introduction.